The barn door groaned open just enough to spill a blade of dying afternoon light across the dusty floor. It caught the shape of a woman, small and thin, who swayed in the opening like a sapling in a hard wind. Her dress was the color of parched earth, torn at the hem and clinging to a frame that seemed too fragile to hold up a life. She took one stumbling step inside, her bare foot leaving a smear in the dust. Her face, shadowed and bruised along one cheekbone, lifted toward the figure of the man standing by the empty horse stall. Her voice was a dry whisper, a sound like dead leaves scraping on stone. "Please, help me." Then her eyes rolled back and she collapsed, a marionette with its strings cut. Thomas Blackwood didn't move for a full second. The world had a habit of bringing its broken things to his door, and he was tired of mending. His own grief was a house with boarded-up windows. There was no room for anyone else's. But the silence that followed her fall was absolute, broken only by the buzz of a fly near the rafters. He walked over, his worn boots silent in the thick dust. He knelt. The woman was Chinese, her black hair pulled loose from a simple braid, fanning out around her head like spilled ink. She was lighter than he'd expected when he slid his arms under her, light as a half-full sack of grain. He saw the marks then, not just on her face, but a pattern of older, faded yellow and blue bruises ringing her arm. This wasn't the work of a fall. This was the work of a fist. A deep, familiar anger, cold and hard as a river stone, settled in his gut. He stood, lifting her easily, and carried her out of the barn's gloom and into the harsh, unforgiving light of the sun. He walked toward the small, lonely cabin that was his only claim on the world, the screen door sighing shut behind them. She woke to the slow, rhythmic tick of a mantel clock. The sound was steady, a world away from the noise of her fear. She was lying on a narrow cot, a rough wool blanket pulled up to her chin. The room was simple, spare. A stone fireplace, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a single window looking out onto a vast, empty stretch of prairie. A man sat at the table, his back to her, cleaning a piece of tack with a slow, methodical motion. He was large, but his stillness made him seem like a part of the landscape, like a boulder or an old tree. She flinched, pulling the blanket tighter, the movement making a small sound. He stopped his work but didn't turn around. "There's water on the crate next to you," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like he didn't use it much. She saw the tin cup, condensation beading on its side. Her throat was a desert. She reached for it with a trembling hand, the bruises on her arm aching with the movement. She drank, the cool water a shock of life. After a moment she found her voice again, still thin, but there. "Where am I?" "My place," he answered, still not looking at her. "You're safe. For now." For now. The words hung in the quiet room. Safety was a currency she didn't possess. "They will come for me." He finally turned, his face set in hard lines, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to see more than a man ought to. "Who's they?" She swallowed hard, the name a poison on her tongue. "My husband's family, the Crofts." Thomas felt the name land in the center of his chest. Franklin Croft owned the valley, the water rights, the general store, and half the souls in the county. He was a pillar of the church, a man whose name was spoken with a mixture of respect and fear. Thomas had lost his own small ranch to Croft's legal machinations years ago, after his wife and son were taken by the fever. Croft had offered a pittance, calling it a kindness. Thomas had taken it and moved to this worthless patch of land at the edge of nowhere, content to be forgotten. But the world, it seemed, wasn't done with him yet. He looked at the woman, at the terror in her dark eyes, and saw the shadow of the man who had taken everything from him. The next afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, a black speck growing steadily larger against the shimmering heat. Thomas watched from the porch, his hand resting on the worn handle of the axe leaning against the wall. He had told the woman, May, she had whispered her name was, to stay inside, out of sight. The rider was too clean, his horse too fine. This wasn't a lost cowhand. This was a messenger. The man reined in his horse a polite distance from the cabin and dismounted. He was dressed in town clothes, a dark coat despite the oppressive heat. He smiled a thin, bloodless smile. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "My name is Davies. I represent Mr. Franklin Croft." Thomas said nothing. He just watched. The lie sat in the air between them, heavy as stone. Davies' smile didn't falter. "We have a delicate situation. A young woman, the widow of Mr. Croft's late son, has wandered off. She's unwell, confused. Her mother-in-law is beside herself with worry." He gestured vaguely toward the vast, empty land. "We've been searching for her. We were told you sometimes offer aid to travelers." The civility was a mask, thin as paper over something ugly. Thomas knew what Davies was asking. He was asking if property had been found. "Ain't seen anyone," Thomas said, his voice flat. "I see," Davies said, his eyes flicking from Thomas's face to the cabin door and back again. "She is a small woman, Chinese, perhaps easily missed." The emphasis was slight, but it was there. A warning. "Mr. Croft is a generous man. He would be deeply grateful for her safe return. He considers her family." The word family sounded like a curse. Thomas thought of the bruises on May's arm, the terror that had her curled up on the cot inside like a startled animal. He met Davies' gaze, his own face unreadable as granite. "I told you," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I ain't seen her." The silence stretched, taut as a wire. The cicadas buzzed, oblivious. Davies held his gaze for a long moment, the smile finally fading from his lips, replaced by a cold assessment. He had delivered his message. The threat was now officially on the table. "Very well," Davies said, turning back to his horse. "If you should happen upon a confused young woman, you know who is looking for her." He swung into the saddle, a picture of respectable authority. "The entire valley is looking for her." He wheeled the horse around and rode away, leaving behind nothing but a cloud of dust and the chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. After the dust from Davies' horse had settled back into the earth, Thomas went inside. The cabin was dim and hot, the air thick with unspoken fear. May was sitting on the edge of the cot, her hands clenched together in her lap, her knuckles white. She had heard everything. Her face was a pale mask, her eyes wide and dark. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows I am here." "He suspects," Thomas corrected, his voice rough. "It ain't the same thing." He walked to the stove and poured a dipper of water into the basin, the sound loud in the tense quiet. He washed his hands, scrubbing away the grime of the farm and the invisible stain of the conversation. He was a man who preferred fences to conversations, solitude to company. He had drawn a line around his life, and Franklin Croft's man had just stepped right over it. He had a choice. He could tell her to leave, to take her trouble somewhere else, and he could go back to his empty days and hollow nights. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. He dried his hands on a scrap of cloth, the silence stretching between them. He thought of his wife's face, the last time he'd seen it, pale with fever. He thought of his son, a small boy with his mother's eyes, gone too soon. He had been helpless then, raging against a sickness he couldn't fight. This was different. This was a man, a fist, a system of power built on cruelty and masked by piety. This was something he could stand against. He turned and looked at May. She hadn't moved. She was watching him, her expression stripped of everything but a desperate, fragile hope. She was waiting for her sentence. He saw not just a frightened woman, but a reflection of every promise he had failed to keep to his own family. He would not fail again. He walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. He wasn't a man for comforting words or soft gestures. His promises were made of action. "You listen to me," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of an oath. "You're under my roof, my protection. They won't take you." Tears welled in her eyes, silent and immediate. They traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. She didn't make a sound, just nodded, a small, jerking motion. For the first time since she had stumbled into his barn, a piece of the terror receded from her face, replaced by a flicker of something he hadn't seen in his own mirror for years. Trust. He had spoken the words, and now they were a part of him. He was no longer just a man hiding from his ghosts. He was a shield, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that Franklin Croft would do everything in his power to break him. Thomas knew he couldn't keep her hidden forever. Croft's reach was long. He needed help, and there was only one person in the nearby town of Redemption he trusted not to be on Croft's payroll. He left May with a bowl of stew and his old hunting rifle, which he placed on the table with a quiet finality. He didn't show her how to use it. Its presence was statement enough. Then he saddled his horse and rode. The town was a dusty collection of clapboard buildings shimmering in the late afternoon heat. He bypassed the saloon and the sheriff's office, heading straight for the small house with the neat white fence at the end of the main street. Dr. Gable's house. He found Martha Gable tending the withered roses in her front garden, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed straw hat. She was the doctor's wife, a woman whose own quiet grief was as well known as her husband's skill. They had lost their only daughter to diphtheria 2 winters back, and a light had gone out of her. She looked up as he approached, her eyes questioning. "Thomas," she said, her voice soft. "It's been a long while." "Martha," he acknowledged with a nod. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I need your help, and the doc's." He told her the story, not all of it, but enough. He spoke of the woman, the bruises, the name she had whispered. He spoke of Davy's visit, the polite threat hanging in the air. He watched her face as he spoke. Her expression shifted from mild curiosity to a deep, resonant sorrow, and then to a slow burning anger that firmed her jaw and brought a spark back to her tired eyes. She had seen Croft's brand of charity up close. She had seen families broken by his business deals. She knew the truth behind the respectable facade. "The law won't help," Thomas finished, his voice low. "The sheriff drinks Croft's whiskey." Martha stripped off her gardening gloves, her movements precise and deliberate. "The law isn't the only authority in this world, Thomas. There's what's right." She looked past him, toward the hazy line of the hills where his homestead lay. "My husband is out on a call, but he'll be back after dark. Bring her here, tonight. No one will think twice about the doctor having a late patient." It was more than he had hoped for. An ally, a safe house, if only for a night. "She's scared," Thomas said, the words feeling inadequate. "Of course she is," Martha replied, her voice gaining a steely edge he hadn't heard in years. "But she is not alone anymore. Tell her that." She met his gaze, and for a moment he saw a shared understanding pass between them. Two people who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear from a man like Franklin Croft. "You bring her, Thomas. We'll be ready." Under the thin light of a sliver moon, Thomas rode back to his cabin, this time with May riding behind him, her small hands holding tight to his sides. The journey was silent, every rustle of sagebrush, every cry of a distant coyote, stretching their nerves thin. Martha was waiting as promised, a single lantern burning in the front window, a small beacon of yellow safety in the vast, dark expanse. She ushered them inside quickly, her presence calm and reassuring. Dr. Gable, a kind-faced man with weary eyes, was there. He examined May's injuries with gentle hands, his face growing grimmer with each faded bruise he uncovered. "This is old work and new," he said quietly to Thomas, while Martha led May into the other room with a cup of tea and a soft-spoken promise of a warm bath. "She's been living with this for a long time." Later, while May slept soundly for the first time in weeks, tucked into the Gables' daughter's old bed, Martha sat with Thomas at her kitchen table. The house was still, filled with the ghosts of a family that once was. "She told me a little," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her husband, Daniel, he was Croft's younger son. He married her against his father's wishes. Franklin never forgave either of them for it." The story tumbled out in the quiet kitchen. Daniel had been a gentle soul, nothing like his father. He had died in a riding accident 6 months ago. Since then, May had been a prisoner, tended to by Daniel's mother, a woman broken by her husband's will, who visited her own misery upon the girl who she blamed for her son's defiance and death. "It isn't just about getting her away, Thomas," Martha said, her hands wrapped around a cold teacup. "As long as she is alive, she is a loose end, a testament to Daniel's rebellion. Croft won't ever let her go. He'll hunt her down, and when he finds her, he'll simply have her disappear. For her own good, of course, for her illness." The word hung in the air. Illness. The excuse for everything. Thomas looked at his own calloused hands, hands that had built and lost and buried. Hiding May wasn't a solution. It was just a delay. They weren't fighting a man. They were fighting a story. The one Franklin Croft told the world about himself. The only way to win was to tell a truer one. "There's the Founders' Day picnic," Thomas said, the idea forming slowly, a dangerous and desperate shape. "On Sunday, the whole town will be there, the preacher, the mayor, everyone." Martha looked at him, her eyes widening as she understood. "In front of everyone? Thomas, that's suicide. He'll destroy you. He'll destroy her." "He's trying to destroy her now, in the dark," Thomas countered, his voice a low rumble. "Maybe the only place she's safe is in the light." It was a terrible gamble, a public confrontation, her word against his, the word of a frightened Chinese widow against the most powerful man in the valley. It was insane, it was hopeless, and it was the only chance they had. Martha was silent for a long time, the weight of the decision pressing down on the small, quiet house. Finally she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice firm with a conviction that chased the shadows from her face. "In the light." The next 2 days were a blur of tense quiet and whispered preparations. May stayed with the Gables, slowly regaining a sliver of strength. The bruises on her face began to fade, but the ones in her eyes remained. She spoke little, but she watched Martha and Thomas with a fierce, searching intensity. She was trying to measure the depth of their resolve, to see if it was strong enough to stand on. Thomas spent the time at his ranch, going about his chores with a grim determination, half expecting Davies or a deputized ranch hand to ride over the hill at any moment. But the valley remained quiet, a deceptive calm before a storm. On Saturday night, Thomas went back into town. He sat with May and Martha in the Gables' parlor, the lantern casting long shadows on the walls. "Tomorrow," Thomas said, looking directly at May, "he will be there. He will be smiling. He will look like a king." He paused, letting the weight of the image settle. "He will not expect you." May's hands trembled where they lay in her lap. What must I do?" she asked, her voice small. "You must be brave for 5 minutes," Martha said, her voice gentle but firm. She reached out and placed her hand over May's. "You must tell them what was done to you. Not all of it, just one thing. One true thing that they cannot deny." Thomas added his own piece of counsel, his words spare as always. "Look at him when you speak. Let them see you are not afraid of him any more." It was a simple plan, and its success rested entirely on the courage of the most vulnerable person among them. They sat in silence for a moment, the three of them, a strange and broken alliance bound by a shared sense of justice. A grieving man, a grieving woman, and a terrified survivor. As Thomas stood to leave, May spoke his name. "Mr. Blackwood." He turned. "My husband," she said, her voice clear and steady for the first time. "He told me there were still good men. I did not believe him. Not until now." Thomas gave a short, sharp nod, unable to find words. He walked out into the cool night air, the woman's words echoing in the hollow places inside him. He was not a good man. He was just a man who had run out of things to lose, and in doing so, had found something to protect. Sunday dawned gray and overcast, the sky a heavy, bruised lid over the valley. The Founders' Day picnic was held in the oak grove behind the church, a place of forced cheerfulness and public piety. Thomas rode into town with May beside him on a gentle mare borrowed from the Gables. Martha was already there, a pillar of quiet dignity among the chattering townsfolk. Franklin Croft stood near the preacher, accepting greetings like a feudal lord, his man Davies hovering nearby. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a picture of benevolent authority. His smile was wide and his laugh was loud, but his eyes were cold, constantly scanning the crowd. When he saw Thomas Blackwood walk into the clearing, his smile tightened. When he saw the small Chinese woman walking at Thomas's side, it vanished completely. A murmur went through the crowd. People stopped talking, their heads turning. Davy started forward, his face a mask of polite fury. But Thomas simply put a hand on his chest and moved past him, his eyes locked on Croft. He walked May to the center of the clearing, into the sudden, heavy silence. "Croft," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the quiet grove. It wasn't a shout, but it had the force of one. Franklin Croft composed himself, his face becoming a mask of paternal concern. "Mr. Blackwood, I am relieved. You found our poor lost May. We've been so worried." He took a step toward them, his arms open in a gesture of welcome. "Come, child, let's get you home." May flinched, shrinking behind Thomas. "She is home," Thomas said, not moving, "and she has something to say." Croft's eyes narrowed. The mask was slipping. "The girl is unwell. She is not herself. She needs rest, not an audience." He was trying to control the story, to paint her as mad. It was now or never. Thomas looked down at May. Her face was ashen with fear, but as she looked up at him, she saw the unwavering resolve in his eyes. She took a shaky breath, remembering Martha's words. One true thing. She stepped out from behind Thomas, a small, solitary figure in the face of immense power. She looked directly at Franklin Croft. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was clear, and it did not tremble. "He says I am unwell," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. The entire town was listening now, frozen in place. "He says I am confused." She slowly raised her arm and pushed up the sleeve of her simple dress, revealing the landscape of old and new bruises, a tapestry of cruelty in shades of purple and yellow. "My husband's mother did this." She told me it was what Mr. Croft wished. She said it was the price for my husband's disobedience in marrying me." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was one thing to hear rumors, to suspect the darkness that lived behind the walls of the powerful. It was another to see it laid bare on a woman's skin in the light of day. Franklin Croft's face went from pale to a mottled, furious red. The story was no longer his. "Lies," he thundered, his voice booming with practiced authority. "The girl is hysterical. She fell. She is a danger to herself." But his words were hollow. The crowd wasn't looking at him anymore. They were looking at the bruises on May's arm. They were looking at her small, determined face. They were looking at Thomas Blackwood standing beside her like a mountain, unmovable. And they were looking at Martha Gable, the respected doctor's wife, who stepped forward to stand on May's other side, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. The alliance was now public. The lie was broken. The sheriff, a man who normally wouldn't spit without Croft's permission, looked from Croft to the crowd and back again. He saw the shift, the sudden, terrifying transfer of power from one man's wealth to the collective conscience of a town. He cleared his throat, his hand moving uncertainly toward his pistol belt. He didn't have to do anything more. In that moment, Franklin Croft was no longer a pillar of the community. He was just a monster, exposed. His influence had evaporated into the gray afternoon air, undone by a few quiet words and the undeniable truth of a patterned bruise. He stood there, isolated and powerless, in the center of the world he had built, his reign of fear over. They rode back to the ranch as dusk was settling, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't the tense, watchful quiet of the past few days. It was a comfortable silence, full of things understood but not needing to be said. When they reached the cabin, Thomas unsaddled the horses while May went inside. The air was cooling, and the first fireflies were beginning to stitch the twilight with tiny, fleeting sparks of orange light. When he walked inside, a smell he hadn't experienced in years met him. Fresh bread. May was standing by the stove, a clean apron tied around her waist, her face smudged with flour. She had found his meager supplies and worked a small miracle. A hesitant smile touched her lips. "I hope it is all right," she said. He looked at the 2 loaves of bread cooling on the table, at the small pot of stew simmering on the stove. He looked at her, standing in the warm lantern light of his kitchen, and the cold, hollow space inside his chest felt a little less empty. "It's all right," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. They ate at the small table, the ticking of the clock a steady, peaceful rhythm. For the first time, May ate like she was hungry, not like she was afraid the food would be taken away. After they had finished, Thomas was cleaning the plates when he heard a sound. It was small and strange, a rusty noise, like a hinge that hadn't been used in a long time. He turned. May was looking at the ranch's scruffy cat, who was batting clumsily at a loose thread on her dress. And she was laughing. It was a small, quiet laugh, but it was real. It was the sound of a life beginning again. He felt his own lips twitch into a smile, an expression that felt foreign on his face. He finished the dishes and walked out onto the porch into the deep velvet dark of the country night. The fireflies were a galaxy in the tall grass. A moment later, May came out and stood beside him, wrapping a thin shawl around her shoulders. They stood for a long time without speaking, watching the silent, hopeful lights. The world was still a hard place, and their futures were uncertain, but they were not alone. He was no longer just a broken man, and she was no longer just a survivor. They were something new, something forged in danger and sealed in courage. "Thomas," she said softly, not looking at him. "May," he replied. It was all that was needed. On a small, forgotten ranch at the edge of the world, under a sky full of stars, a family had been born.